Well, hello everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started here. Wanted to run through last week's Futato exercises, and then we'll also talk a little bit about the final exam. Basically what to expect, how many questions are going to be on it, what kind of questions, what do you need to study for, that sort of a thing. So hang tight for that, but we want to go through chapter 36 and 37 as far as the exercises go, and talk a little bit about the nifal conjugation. That music you hear in the background, that's my attempt to try to drown out background noise. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So hopefully it helps you focus, because this is a preview for you. If you've ever heard of Brain FM, I find it effective. They claim they've actually got a published paper on how the frequencies are supposed to help you study or whatever, or help you focus. Not a paid promotion. I'm not getting any money from them. In fact, I'm paying to access this, but hopefully you don't find it obtrusive. There will probably be random screams in the background from my 4-year-old, so the idea is to drown some of that out as much as possible. We'll jump in here to chapter 36, looking at the nifal. And I talked last time in our last conference about some of the primary, secondary, tertiary, maybe even quaternary characteristics of the different stems and the different conjugations, or maybe the different patterns as Futato refers to them, and the different conjugations. I just want to go through that for you also here in the nifal before we jump into the exercises, kind of give you a heads up of what I'm looking for. So here he begins by talking about the function of the nifal, or the meaning. What does the nifal pattern do to the meaning of a verb? And for the most part, it's the passive version of what you would find in the cal. So you see here, zakar means he remembered. Well, nizkar would be he was remembered. Karat, he cut. Nikrat would be he was cut. So it's basically just the passive form of the primary meaning that you've learned. That said, there are a few verbs in Hebrew that don't have a cal pattern. They don't have a form in the cal, and the nifal is their primary form. And a lot of times that means that they're not going to appear, or they're not going to seem to be translated as passive. They're going to perhaps have sort of an active meaning. So just be aware of that when you run into that. That's what your lexicon is for. After Hebrew 1, once you get out of this first year of Hebrew, you're not meant to avoid your lexicon. You know, we don't want you using the lexicon on quizzes and stuff like that, because we want to emphasize the importance of vocabulary. You need to learn your vocabulary. You need to know what these words mean that you're learning, because you're learning the first 300 to 500 most frequent words in the Hebrew Bible, and you can't rely on the crutch of a lexicon. You need to know what those words mean. But once you get that basic, foundation of vocabulary, the lexicon actually becomes your friend, because we can't expect you to know the meaning of every word in the Hebrew Bible, every verb in the Hebrew Bible even, let alone meanings beyond the cal stem or the cal pattern. So the lexicon after first year is really your friend. You want to learn to use that well. It's going to tell you when a verb does not have a cal form, when its base meaning is in either the nifal, or like we've talked about before, maybe the base meaning is pl, like davar is actually diber, or when that base meaning is in the hifil, whatever. So something to just be aware of. You're going to start using your lexicon more and more as we move beyond first year Hebrew. All right, so reflexive is also another potential function of the nifal. And then, like it says here, some, they just have an active sense. So lacham and now lacham kind of from the word milchama. If you put a mem on the front of this and a comet say at the end, you actually get milchama. the word for battle. So the verb root from which milchama comes is lacham, and since it doesn't have a kal form, its lexical form, well, I should say, the lexical form of verbs, generally speaking, is just the verbal root, but its basic form is going to be nilcham in the nifal, because it doesn't have a kal form. All right, good enough. He says here nifal is abbreviated NIPH. If you use NIF, that's fine with me. I often use an F in place of PH here, but no big deal. Looking at the form here. So he says the primary characteristic of the nifal is a prefixed noon. Now this is true in the perfect, but this does not work in the imperfect. And so I prefer to think of these characteristics as associated with conjugations and with patterns. So in the nifal perfect, yes, the primary characteristic is a prefixed noon with a heroic prefix vowel. So if you see a noon heroic at the beginning, you're going to, if you know you're in the perfect, you're going to know that's in the nifal stem. What you might realize quite quickly here is that this is very similar to another form that we've already learned. In the kal imperfect, we also have a noon heroic prefix. So what's the difference? Well, often in the kal imperfect, our theme vowel is a holum. So that right there would distinguish, if you had a holum here, that would distinguish the nifal perfect from the kal imperfect, 1CP. But often you get a patach theme vowel in the kal imperfect, and so it's not 100% reliable. So you're going to run into a situation oftentimes where you have to let context determine whether you're looking at a nifal perfect or a kal imperfect 1CP. Now, you might wonder, well, if this is what the nifal perfect looks like, what does the nifal imperfect 1CP look like? And we'll get there. It'll look different, but when you're in the perfect, the primary characteristic or diagnostic or whatever you want to think of it as, the primary is a noon prefix with a heroic prefix vowel. You'll see that occurs all the way through the perfect conjugation. Every single perfect form in the nifal has that noon heroic prefix. And then all of your suffixes are exactly what you would expect. So the only difference between the nifal perfect and the kal perfect is going to be this noon heroic prefix all the way through the perfect conjugation. All right, so let's take a look here at the imperfect. Now, when we get to the imperfect conjugation, the primary characteristic of the nifal imperfect is no longer the noon prefix. Okay? Now, it's there. You know, it's showing you right here that basically we put a prefix, a yod heroic prefix, on top of the noon prefix. All right, and so here, instead of our R1 vowel closing the prefix syllable, which it did in the kal, you see here the kof is what closes this prefix syllable. Instead, it is the noon that closes that prefix syllable now. The problem is whenever we have a noon closing a syllable, that noon is going to assimilate into the next letter. And so what happens is we get a kof with a dagesh. Now, since the noon is closing the prefix syllable, this R1 vowel is free to retain a full vowel. We didn't have a full vowel in R1 in the kal because we had to use R1 to close that syllable. But now that noon is closing that syllable, we've got a letter here that needs a vowel. And it's free to take a full medium or long vowel, however you think of this, because it is pre-tonic. And since we've got an open pre-tonic syllable, that actually wants to have a long or medium vowel. And so we get the kamates here. Now, the difference that you're going to notice in the nifal from the kal imperfect is that your theme vowel here its base form is a sere. Now, whenever you have a vocalic suffix that you add, of course that sere is going to reduce to a schwa. We've seen that with a lot of theme vowels when you add a vocalic, or when you add, honestly, just about any sort of a suffix, we get a reduction here to a schwa. The one tricky thing to recognize is when you get to the 3FP and the 2FP forms. All of a sudden in these forms, we don't have the sere or the schwa. Here, for some reason, it's going to shift back to a patach. So just be aware that these feminine plural forms, these are going to have a patach theme vowel. But that's okay, because the sere here, this is really kind of a tertiary characteristic of the nifal imperfect. Your primary characteristic in the nifal imperfect is going to be the dagesh in R1 with the kametz in R1. This is your primary characteristic of the nifal imperfect. When you see R1, and again, when you're coming to a verb, you may not realize that this is R1. You may think that R1 is the first, but eventually, if you go through that methodology, how many letters do I have? You know, what could be a prefix, what could be a suffix? Once you get down to your root, if you have a dagesh and a kametz in R1, that is set off the alarm. That is going to be your nifal imperfect. All right. So once we've got that, we can, and I said that the sere here is more of a tertiary. That's because the dagesh and the kametz are kind of tied for primary. You don't really get a secondary. These are both important, but certainly the sere theme vowel is subordinate in its importance to these two right here. So your primary characteristic, what you want to be looking for, is a dagesh in R1 and a kametz in R2. All right, everything else is the same, except for that theme vowel of a regular kal imperfect verb. You've still got your normal prefixes. You've still got your normal hiric prefix vowel that shifts to a schwa in the aleph, but everything else is normal. You don't have anything else unusual aside from that theme vowel and the dagesh and kametz in R1. All right, so moving to the imperative, here it gets a little bit tricky because the imperative loses the prefix vowel of, that's my daughter that you can hear in the background there. The imperative is going to lose the prefix vowel that we had in the imperfect. But if we lose the prefix vowel, then how do we get the noon to kind of stay in place here? We don't want to lose this diagnostic dagesh and kametz in R1. We want to keep that because that's a really good sign that we're looking at a nifal here. So what are we going to do? Well, what we do is we actually use the hey here as a placeholder. This hey is going to be a placeholder for the imperative or for the imperfect prefix. And so it's standing in for that prefix that we've lost so that we can maintain this dagesh and this kametz. Because if we were to just take off the prefix altogether, we'd end up with a noon prefix. And then in order to maintain the kametz, we'd have to have a schwa under the noon. That way the kof wouldn't have to close the syllable. The schwa under the noon reminds us of the pl. It's a whole mess. And so what we really want to do is we want to keep this dagesh kametz in R1 to remind us that we're in the nifal pattern. So the only way to do that really is to have something come and stand in for the prefix that we've lost. And so we use the hey to do that. Now, obviously, a hey hiric prefix is going to be reminiscent of the hifil in the imperfect. Or, I'm sorry, the hifil in the perfect conjugation. Well, how do we distinguish between the nifal imperative and the hifil perfect? We can distinguish easily between the nifal imperative and the hifil imperative because the hifil imperative is going to use the patach prefix vowel. So we can tell the difference between those. But how do we tell the difference between a nifal imperative and a hifil perfect, where the hifil perfect has the hey-heric prefix as well? Well, again, the way you're going to tell the difference between those two is the R1 vowel. In the hifil perfect, you are going to have let's just go ahead and pull it up. You're going to get that R1 closing the prefix like you do in a regular cal imperfect. So let's pull that up real quick. Hifil strong verbs in the cal, hifil strong verbs in the perfect. You've got this situation here where you've got the hey-heric prefix, but R1 is going to close that syllable. So the way you tell the difference between a hifil perfect and a nifal imperfect is, first of all, the hifil perfect, R1 is going to close the prefix, so it's not going to have its own vowel. It's not going to have a dagesh. And in the hifil perfect, in the third person, you're going to have a heric yod theme vowel, and otherwise you're going to have a patak. Now, it's pretty easy to tell the difference between the hifil perfect and the nifal imperative just from the suffixes, because the only suffixes that you're going to get in let's go back here to the nifal. The only suffixes that you're going to get in the nifal imperative are going to be heric yod, which does not occur as a suffix in the perfect conjugation. In the hifil perfect, you won't see heric yod. You will see tav heric yod as a prefix in the hifil perfect, because that is the one CP suffix, but you won't see just heric yod. You also won't see a shurik. Well, okay, you will see a shurik. So what is the difference here between the nifal imperative 2MP, that's this form? What is the difference between that and, I'd love to have a place to draw here, but this particular program isn't going to let me. So let me move this to the side, and then let me move this to the side, and then I'm going to move this out of the way. And shoot, as I'm sharing my screen, it's not going to let me. Yeah, let's do it this way. Instead of sharing on here, let's just go to Word. All right. So over here, we get the nifal imperative 2MP. We get hikatlu. What we're trying to figure out is what is the difference between that and, let's go up to about 24. Let's go SBL Hebrew. And then let's get our Hebrew text. What is the difference between that and the hifil perfect 3CP? Well, this is what the hifil perfect 3CP would look like. We've got hey, heric. We're going to have kof, shavah, because that kof is going to close the prefix. Then we're going to get tet. All right, now for the 3MS, we would have heric yod, lamed. But the 3CP is going to add the shurik. And when we add the shurik, we have to come back here and we have to reduce that heric yod to a shavah. So the difference is going to be hik telu in the 3CP. In the nifal imperative, this is again hifil perfect 3CP. In the nifal imperative to MP, we're not going to have hik telu, we're going to have hikatelu. Okay? Hikatelu, we're still going to maintain that dagesh and kametz in R1. So again, this is going to be your primary diagnostic for the nifal in the imperfect side of the family. All right, so there are going to be a lot of forms that are similar. There are going to be a lot of opportunities to confuse the hey heric of the hifil, specifically hifil perfect, with the hey heric of the nifal imperative and infinitive, but they won't be identical. There will be a way to tell them apart. So don't worry too much about that. If you're able to do your parsing according to the methodology that I've been talking about, kind of looking for these diagnostics and everything, you should be able to tell them apart. All right, so that is how we tell the difference between a strange form of the Nifal. Here we don't have the, we do have the noon still. Again, remember, the noon is in that dogish. That dogish represents the noon that has assimilated. But because we've lost, again, imperative and infinitive is basically the, imperative and infinitive is basically the imperfect form with the prefix removed. In order to keep our diagnostic here, once we remove that prefix, we're going to have to add in something, and so we choose the hey. Why we choose the hey, I can't tell you. Why not something else? Hey does this sort of thing a lot. It kind of stands in where it's needed, so I can't give you the historical explanation for it, but it is what it is. So don't let the hey, Hirik, and the Nifal confuse you here. You've still got your dogish in R1 and your kamets in R1. All right, moving to the infinitive. Again, the infinitive construct is going to look identical to the imperative 2ms form. So that shouldn't throw you off too much. You're going to use context to tell the difference, but they will be identical. And then the absolute of the infinitive here, there are two different forms that you might encounter. One is a little bit more what you might expect of the infinitive absolute in the Nifal, which is just the noon Hirik prefix, and then the holum theme vowel. This is not usually going to have the holum vav, and so because of that, this form is actually identical. The Nifal infinitive absolute form here, this particular version of that form, is identical to a Cal imperfect 1CP. So in that case, you will need to ask yourself, does this make more sense as an infinitive absolute or as an imperfect? Chances are it's going to be easy to tell which one it is. The infinitive absolute is not going to occur without some other verb form that it is working with. So it shouldn't be too hard to spot the infinitive absolute when it does occur like this. When it occurs this way, it has that more characteristic hey Hirik prefix with the dogish and kamets in R1, and then you've got the holum theme vowel, which is the only time in the Nifal you're going to get a holum theme vowel. All right, so still distinct enough to tell the difference between the infinitive construct, which has the sere theme vowel, and the infinitive absolute, which has the holum theme vowel. The participle form, unfortunately, it's not as simple as the mem prefix that we have in the hifil and the pl and even the pool and hofal, but it's still relatively straightforward. What is the difference between the Cal, the Cal imperfect 1CP and the Nifal participle masculine singular? Well, the Cal imperfect 1CP is going to have the holum theme vowel up here. All right. When you get this kamets with the noon Hirik prefix, you can bet that that is the participle. All right. The participle is going to be distinguished by this theme vowel. All right. So you're going to see this word, and the first thing you're going to notice is noon and then 3 root letters. And so you're going to say, oh, I've got a noon Hirik prefix. Well, a noon Hirik prefix could tell you a couple different things. This could either be a Cal imperfect 1CP, or it could be a Nifal perfect, but the Nifal perfect is going to have the patach theme vowel here, or it could be a Nifal participle masculine singular. So when you've got that noon Hirik prefix, just be aware there's more than one option. We know that there's more than one option because we've seen the Cal imperfect 1CP, and obviously we're in the Nifal, so the Nifal perfect also looks very similar, but the Nifal perfect 3ms is going to have the patach theme vowel. The nifal participle, masculine singular, is going to have the kametz theme vowel. All right. And then we get here to the feminine singular. We get that segel segel tav pattern that we were used to in the kal. It's just that where the kal had the holum in R1 diagnostic, the holum characteristic here in R1, the nifal has the noon-heric prefix, and the kof closes that syllable. So that's the difference between the nifal participle and the kal participle in the feminine singular. You get to the masculine plural, it's going to be pretty straightforward. You're going to recognize that you've got a heric yod mem suffix, which is going to tell you masculine plural noun, adjective, or participle. And then you've got a noon-heric prefix, so that should pretty easily tell you that you've got a nifal with your participle. All right, because obviously the kal imperfect is not going to have a heric yod mem suffix. So once you see this, you know you're not in a kal imperfect, you know you're not in a nifal perfect, you are in a participle. And the only time the participle is going to have a noon-heric prefix is with the nifal pattern. Same thing goes for the feminine plural. When you see the holum vav tav ending, you know that you don't have a perfect, you know that you don't have an imperfect. The holum vav tav ending could throw you for a little bit of a loop and make you think that you have an infinitive construct of a third hey. The difference is going to be how many root letters do you have left. So in the nifal, you're going to have the holum vav tav even when you have 3 root letters left. If this were a third hey, you would have to acknowledge that you've got only 2 left. But that noon-heric prefix with the holum vav tav, that's a good indication that you're in the nifal. Between participle and a third hey infinitive construct, you're just going to have to work with some of the context, which makes more sense here. If you've got 3 root letters, it's obvious that you don't have a third hey infinitive construct because you already have your 3 root letters, and in the third hey infinitive construct, the third hey, the third root letter, would be missing. All right, cohortative. Really, just like you'd expect, it is the imperfect 1CS form plus a kametz hey, and the imperfect 1CP form with a kametz hey added. So nothing really strange here or unusual, just pretty much what you'd expect. We still have the diagnostic dagesh and kametz in R1 in both of these. Jussive, again, nothing really unusual here. It's really what we would expect. It's going to look identical to the imperfect. We saw that the hifil, when the hifil goes into the jussive, it takes a shortened form. Also, third hey verbs, when they go into the jussive, they take a shortened form. Nifal, it's just your regular nifal jussive, looks exactly like the nifal imperfect. So there's really nothing unusual here. How do you tell the difference? Context. All right, and then finally the vav relative form. It's going to be exactly what you'd expect. The vav relative goes on the jussive form, and so when you see the vav relative added to the jussive, there's no surprises. It's exactly what it should be. All right, real quick, let me go through pronunciation on the vocabulary from last week as well, just so we're all on the same page here. So again, when you have blue syllables here, that's Futato's way of saying that this is an accented syllable. So this is not nekoshet, this is nekoshet. Nekoshet, that's copper or bronze. Sun is going to be shemesh. This is a segelit, so it is pronounced on the first letter, shemesh. Then we have the word nava or niba. Nava is the kal form here, and then niba is the nifal form. And what's happening here is the noon heric is getting added. Sorry, I pulled my headphones out of my microphone. The noon heric is getting added to the noon kametz, and because of that, this noon is now going to have to close the noon heric syllable. So when that happens, it loses its kametz and it turns into a dagesh in the bait. All right, that's what's going on there. All right, and again, that means prophesy. Now, my guess is, because it's giving the nifal meaning as active, my guess is you're never going to see this cow form. It just doesn't occur. It's just giving you that for the sake of reference to show you what has happened. Because otherwise, this might actually look like a PL. You know, you've got what looks like Hirik in what looks like R1, and then you've got a dagesh in what looks like R2. But this noon here is not R1. This is the prefix noon. And when the prefix noon attaches to the R1 noon, the R1 noon now is going to assimilate into the bait. So that's important to realize what's happening there. So again, Niba would be he prophesied. Okay? Because again, this is still the perfect conjugation, even though it's the nifal pattern. So Niba is he prophesied. All right, if we wanted to make this he will prophesy, now we're going to have to put it in the imperfect conjugation, which would be something probably like yibay, or not yibay, but probably yiba. You would have the yod here instead of the noon. Yin. Actually, that's interesting. I wonder what it would look like, because you've already got a noon assimilated in here. It's not like your prefix is going to assimilate as well. Let me look this up and see. Actually, I want to do a morphology search here, so let me pull up my main screen. I want to do lemma, noon, bait, olive, and then we're going to look for that at verb. We want a nifal imperfect. Let's see if that ever occurs. Oh, well, probably not, because it didn't enter there. Verb, nifal, imperfect. Yeah, it doesn't look like it. I'm not sure why it's. Usually it'll go ahead and do the search and just come up with no results. I'm not sure why it's canceling out like that. Maybe I need a different verb. Nifal. Let's just search for that, I guess. Oh, goodness. Why is it saying it doesn't occur at all? I wonder if I need to do search for root. Noon, bait, olive. All morph text. Well, this is strange. Let's look at our lexicon and see what that can tell us. Let's just go up here. Noon, bait, olive. Am I typing this wrong? Nifal. See if it's only Aramaic, maybe? Alright, so... Okay, yeah, interesting. So here's the imperfect form. It's going to... Yeah, it's going to allow the R1... I think this is what's happening. It's going to allow the R1 noon to come back out, and then the prefix noon of the nifal pattern is going to assimilate into the R1 noon. So now you've got this really interesting form. But if you come across this form, it's going to be pretty straightforward. You're going to look at this and you're going to say, okay, I've got a dagesh and a patach in what looks like R1. That's a nifal in the the imperfect. That's not going to give you much confusion, I don't think. So yeah, interesting. There's a lot of vowel changes going on there, but I think if you come across either of those forms, you'll probably be all right. Okay, so let's see here. That was Nava or Niba. Let's look here at kavats. Okay, so kavats is to collect, to gather in the kal. So if it were in the perfect, if it were nikbats, that would be he was gathered. So kavats, he gathered. Nikvats, actually nikbats, would be he was gathered. Next word we have ra'ah. Ra'ah. Now this is important to distinguish because we've had a resh aleph hey. Resh aleph hey was he saw, but resh ayin hey is he pastured or he tended. You might say he shepherded. So the difference here is the ayin versus the aleph. So ra'ah with an ayin is a pastoral term. He pastured or he tended. So this presents an interesting question, which we'll, I think, get into in 37. Yeah, the weak roots. Because here we have a letter that won't take a dagesh. So what happens then if we wanted to do... Well, it's not a problem for the perfect because perfect doesn't need a dagesh here. So in the perfect, this would be something like near ah. Near, yeah, it would be ah. It wouldn't be ah. It'd still be the comets because we've got a hey here. So nira would be he was pastured, or he was, or it was tended or pastured. All right. Iron, barzel. My mnemonic for this was iron barbell, except instead of barbell, it's barzel. Hill, gib'ah. I don't know how accurate of a mnemonic this is, but this reminded me of the place Gibeah. I know Gibeah was in the hill country, or at least I think it was. So maybe I'm completely off there, but if you don't associate Gibeah with the hill country, then this isn't going to help you at all. But give, let's see, yeah, give awe. This is a silent shavah because it is preceded by a short vowel. All right, and then next we have guy. Basically, this is a silent shavah here because it's preceded by a short vowel. The aleph is quiescent, so it's just guy. Not really any different from GUY in English. Guy. That means valley. I do not have a mnemonic for that one. Nahar. Nahar is the word for river. The difference between a nahar, river, and a nahal, actually, this is a seglet as well, even though it's not segels. The difference between a nahal, it's hard to distinguish the difference because the resh in Hebrew and the lamed in Hebrew are pronounced very similarly. The difference between a nahar and a nahal is a nahal, a wadi. This is a dried out riverbed, whereas a nahar is an actual running river. All right. Well, here you go. A nahar has water flowing all year round, but a nachal has water only during the rainy season. So there you go. All right, so let's look at the practice here for 36. Let me pull up the workbook assignment and see what we're looking at. Activity A, 1 through 10, and then we'll skip B. All right, so here I'm just going to point out what I'm seeing that tells me I'm in the nifal, and then what tells me I'm in the perfect, imperfect, whatever conjugation. So here, the first thing that I notice is I've got a noon-heric prefix. That tells me one of three things. I might have a cal imperfect 1CP. I might have, hang on one second. My wife's laughing at me and I'd like to know why.
Because you're still getting NFL draft alerts.
Oh. So anyway.
And distracted.
All right, she's laughing at me because my iPad lit up and I looked at it instead of staying focused, apparently. All right, so number one, we've got a nuneheric prefix. This occurs in three different situations usually. These are the three most common. I've either got a cal imperfect 1CP, or I've got a nifal perfect 3MS, or I've got a nifal participle masculine singular. Each of those three, or I could have a nifal infinitive absolute. Each of those four is going to have a different theme vowel. The cal perfect 1CP is going to usually have, I shouldn't say different, the cal perfect 1CP is usually going to have a holum theme vowel, but it could have a patak theme vowel. The nifal perfect is going to have the patak theme vowel. The nifal participle masculine singular is going to have the kametz theme vowel, and the nifal infinitive absolute is going to have the holum theme vowel. So is this a cal imperfect 1CP that happens because sometimes the cal imperfects have a patak theme vowel, or is this a nifal perfect 3MS? Well, if you don't know the verb and you don't know what this verb looks like in the cal imperfect, you may have to go by context. But we know that katal in the cal imperfect 1CP has a holum theme vowel, and it would be niktol. Now, that means that the cal imperfect 1CP for katal is identical to the nifal infinitive absolute of katal, but that's a problem for another time because we don't have either of those forms here. So this nuneheric prefix and the patak tell me that this is a nifal perfect 3MS. Number two, we've got the same form, but here we've got the kametz. So again, I just acknowledge that the nifal participle masculine singular is what has the kametz. So that's what we've got, is a nifal participle, no person, but it's masculine singular from katal. Number three, we've got nilchametem. This is a tricky one here. We've got nilcham, and I said metem, but actually, since this is closing, it's preceded by a short vowel. This is silent, so we have nilchamtem. This is very hard to pronounce, but it shouldn't be too hard to parse. This tem suffix jumps out at me as perfect 2MP. If I'm in the perfect and I've got a nuneheric prefix, that's nifal. So I'm nifal perfect 2MP from lacham. All right, number four. Number four is not as obvious as what we've seen so far. I've got four letters. So what's extra? What's part of the root? Well, bait is never added as a suffix, but yod often is. So yod, let's say that's my prefix. We've got a yod-heric prefix. Pull that off. I have to explain what's going on with this dagesh here. Now, usually when I pull off a prefix, the dagesh was an assimilated nun from a one nun. But if that's the case, if my R1 letter is a nun, then my verbal root would be nun, kof, tav, bait. That's four letters still. So that doesn't make sense. My root is most certainly kof, tav, bait. Well, if my root is kaf, tav, bait, then where does this dagesh come from? What other nun might assimilate? Well, it would be the nun from a it would be a nun from a nifal. So when I think about that, I realize, oh, here I've got my imperfect prefix, and I've got a dagesh and a kametz in R1. Well, this is exactly what I would expect to see for a nifal imperfect. I have no suffix here. The yod prefix tells me that I'm third person masculine, and so the lack of suffix tells me I'm third masculine singular. So I have a nifal imperfect 3ms. Number 5, looking here, I see a noon-heric prefix. Again, that could be one of maybe 4 different options, but let's see what else we've got here. Noon-heric prefix, I've got a dagesh and a kametz in R1, so I've certainly got a nifal, but the noon of the nifal is this dagesh. That means this noon-heric has to be explained some other way. So when do I have a noon-heric prefix that's not related to the nifal? Well, that's in the cal imperfect 1CP. The imperfect 1CP, regardless of the pattern of the stem. So, that tells... Sorry, my headphones again are cut now. That tells me that I have a nifal, as indicated by the dagesh and the kametz in R1, a nifal imperfect, as indicated by the noon-heric prefix, 1CP, as also indicated by the noon-heric prefix. So don't get too confused at the fact that we've got the sign of the nifal here, and then the sign of the imperfect 1CP here. The sign of the nifal is not going to double up. These don't both indicate nifal, okay? Number 6, we've got hishamru. Actually, hishamru. This is going to be a vocal shavah because it's preceded by a, yes, if it has a dagesh, it's going to be a kametz here. So, hishamru, this is going to be nifal in some form because we've got a kametz and a dagesh in R1. So I already know I'm nifal. I'm not perfect because I've got a prefix, and the dagesh kametz in R1, that doesn't work in the nifal perfect. So I'm not in the perfect. Not in the participle, because if I was in a nifal participle, I'd have a noon prefix. I'm not in the imperfect, because I don't have the imperfect prefix letters either, but I do have the placeholder for imperfect prefixes. Prefaces? I'm not sure how you pluralize prefix, but I do have that placeholder. So this is one of those imperfect family conjugations that aren't actually the imperfect. So we're talking infinitive or imperative here. So, which is it? Is it infinitive, construct, or absolute? Well, the shuruk dismisses that idea. The shuruk is not going to occur on an infinitive construct or an infinitive absolute. So that must mean that what I have here is the nifal imperative. Now the shuruk here, sorry, my daughter is playing with glue and trying to dry it by blowing very hard on it. The shuruk here is going to indicate the 2MP form, second masculine plural form of the imperative. So I have a nifal imperative 2MP from shamar. Number 7, again, I've got R1 here, has a dagesh and a kametz. That tells me nifal right away. I've got a prefix, so the prefix conjugation is going to be imperfect, so let's just assume nifal imperfect. Then I have to figure out what the tav prefix with the heric yod suffix indicates. And the tav prefix with heric yod suffix indicates the second feminine singular. So I have a nifal imperfect 2FS from katal. Now you might be asking, okay, right, I see that if you assume this is R1, great, then it makes sense, but how do you know this is R1 and not this? Well, again, it comes down to that process of how many letters do I have? Including the yod, I have 5. Okay, so what's a prefix? What's a suffix? What's part of the root? Well, yod is often added as a suffix, so let's take that off. How many vowels do I have? I have 4. Okay, is lamed ever added as a suffix? No, so that's probably part of my root. Okay, What about, and if that's part of my root, then these others probably are not suffixes. They would be after the lamed. So now let's start looking for prefixes. All right, does tav function as a prefix? Yes. In the imperfect, tav is a prefix for the 3fs, the 2ms, the 2fs, all of those. So let's call tav a prefix. That means I'm left with kof, tate, lamed as my root. That's how I know that kof is R1. I'm just able, because I've been doing this, I've done this so many times, just the practice that I've had, I can go through all those steps really quickly in my head. You still have to build up all that training and practice for it to be immediate, but it won't take forever. You'll start to recognize these, if not already, relatively soon if you stick with it. So that's how I can look at this and immediately know that kof is R1. It's because I've gone through this process in my head already of tav is a prefix, yod is a suffix. Now, I'll be honest, when I'm doing that, I am making a little bit of a jump. I am saying, okay, I see tav, I see hiric yod, I'm going to go ahead and assume that is an imperfect 2fs, prefix and suffix, which would make kof my R1 letter. There are times when I kind of make those quick decisions and I end up being wrong, but I usually figure out that I'm wrong, because I'll get to a certain point and all of a sudden there's something I can't explain based on what I've assumed, and I have to work my way backwards and then go at it again more carefully. So that does happen. The quicker you get with these, the more assumptions you end up making, and so sometimes you're wrong, which is why you always need to be able to fall back on that methodology, fall back on that process, those questions that get you to parse correctly. But after doing it so many times, you start to realize, okay, well, if I have a tav and a yod, 90%, this is what I'm looking at. So let's just assume that for now, and then let's see if everything else makes sense. And here it does. Everything else does make sense. But there will be times when you make those assumptions and you get to a point where you can't explain something. That's where you got to be able to back your way out and come at it again a little bit more carefully. All right, number 8. So here I've got a noon hiric prefix. I also notice a segel tav pattern. Well, this segel tav pattern occurs in verbal forms 2 different places. It can be a form of the 1 yod imperfect, 1 yod vav, imperfect 1 yod vav. It can also be actually not imperfect. That would be sere sere. I guess it would be a 1 yod vav infinitive is what I'm thinking of. So that's one place it can occur, is a 1 yod vav infinitive. But if that were the case, I couldn't have 3 verbal root letters, because one of them would have to be the yod that drops off. And since I've still got 3 here, that doesn't make sense. The other time this segel tav pattern occurs in verbal forms is in the feminine singular participle. Well, that makes much more sense, because that means that my root can be kof, tet, lamed, and the noon hiric over here is a nifal prefix. So that means I have a nifal participle feminine singular from katal. Number 9, I have nishmaru. I see my noon hiric prefix. Several possibilities here. This could either be a cal imperfect 1 CP, but that's not going to work because a shurik is never going to occur with that. Or it could be a nifal perfect 3 CP. That's where I would get a shurik here. Or it could be, my other options would be a nifal participle, but the participle isn't going to have a shurik suffix, or a nifal infinitive absolute, but the nifal infinitive absolute isn't going to have a shurik. So the only one that makes sense is the nifal perfect 3CP from shamar. Number 10. All right, so here, the first thing I notice, again, I'm jumping to conclusions, I'm making assumptions, but the first thing that sticks out at me, aside from the hey heuric prefix, which I kind of note but put off to the side because there's a lot more possibilities for that than there are for the fact that I have a dagesh and a kametz in, let's call it an early letter. Maybe we're not certain this is R1, but it's early, and so it's a good candidate. So I'm going to start with the assumption that I have dagesh, kametz in R1. How do I explain the rest of the word? Well, that dagesh kametz is going to happen in the nifl pattern of the imperfect family. Am I in the imperfect? Nope, this is not an imperfect prefix, but hey heuric is the placeholder for imperfect prefixes, which means if this is R1, I've got a nifl that is either an infinitive construct or an imperative or an infinitive absolute. All right. It's not an infinitive construct because the infinitive construct uses the sere theme vowel. It's not an imperative masculine singular since we don't have a suffix. It's not an imperative masculine singular because that is identical to the infinitive construct form. That also takes a sere theme vowel. The one that takes the holum theme vowel is the nifl infinitive absolute. And of course that doesn't have person, number, or gender. So we've got a nifl infinitive absolute from Catal. All right, so that is section A. Let's double check the next one here. Sorry. Here we go. All right, so C, 1 through 9. All right, so basically the same thing, but we know we're looking at 1 gutturals and 1 nuns here. So let's see how that works. This one, it tells us that it's Cal and Hifil. So this is just review from last time. So we already know, in one sense, I guess it's helpful for practice, but when you're translating, you're not going to know that you're looking at Cal or Hifil. You have to have all your options open. And they're not going to tell you these are either 1 guttural or 1 nun. So this really narrows down your options. Understanding all this, it's easy to see from the tem suffix here that what we're looking at is... sorry, I got another alert that was interesting and it distracted me. This tem suffix here tells me right away that I'm looking at the perfect, maybe not cal, not necessarily cal, but I'm looking at the perfect 2MP. So, what pattern is it? Is it cal, or is it hifil, or nifl, or whatever? Well, it is cal because hifil in the perfect would have a hey heuric prefix, nifl would have a nun heuric prefix, pl would have a heuric in R1, dagesh in R2. So this is cal. There's no other marker here to indicate a different pattern. So we have a cal perfect 2MP from Ahmad. Number 2. How many letters do I have? I have 4. Is dalet a suffix? Nope. Is yod a prefix? Often. All right, so I've got a yod prefix. That would be a great candidate for cal, imperfect, no suffix, yod prefix tells me 3ms. All right, but is it possible that this is a hifil? Because remember, the hifil has the yod patach prefix. The reason why this is not a hifil is because we've got a holum theme vowel. So why then do we have the patach prefix? Why don't we have the heuric prefix that the cow would usually have? That's because we've got, as stated above, a 1 guttural. And this ayin does not want to have, it really can't have a silent shabah, which we would usually expect. And so it's going to need a hatef vowel. Now, the ayin also has a preference for A-class vowels. So it's going to choose the hatef patach in order to close, quote-unquote, the prefix syllable. Well, that means since this chose the A-class hatef vowel, that means that the prefix vowel is also going to be A-class, and so you're going to get the patach there. So even though we usually expect a yod, or I should say a patach prefix vowel for the hifil imperfect, there are other reasons why we might have a patoc prefix vowel even in the cal, and so that's what we have to be aware of. And I don't know why I'm down here because we're looking at this one. If this were hifil, how would it be different? Well, that's what you get in number 3. The difference here is that we have the hifil hirik yod theme vowel. All right, so nothing different happens to the prefix vowel going from cal to hifil here in the imperfect. It's still going to be a patoc. That's not going to change. But what does change is we go from in the cal a holum theme vowel to in the hifil a hirik yod theme vowel. All right. So here we have hifil imperfect 3ms from a mod. Number 4, again, we've got a mod, but here we've got another hirik yod theme vowel. And so this is going to point to hifil, and we will confirm hifil by the fact that we have this hey placeholder for an imperfect. Actually, that may not be true here. Let me think about this. This is a little bit tricky because without knowing for sure off the top of my head which vowel goes where, there are 2 possibilities in my head right now for this. This could either be a hifil perfect 3ms. Now I'm used to, in the hifil perfect, I'm used to seeing a hey hirik prefix, but a hey hirik prefix isn't going to work because I've got a 1 guttural, and that 1 guttural doesn't want does not want to have a shabah. So it's going to take a hatef vowel. Now you might ask, when this happened before and it took a hatef vowel, it took a hatef patoc. It has a preference for A-class vowels. Why would it take a hatef segel? That doesn't make any sense. Well, it does make sense if it has to take a hatef segel in order to distinguish itself from another form that it would look identical to if it took a hatef patoc. And since the placeholder hey for the hifil, since that's going to take in the hifil a patoc in the imperfect forms, that makes me think there's a pretty good chance this is the hifil perfect rather than, let's say, a hifil infinitive construct. If this were a hifil infinitive construct, then I would expect a hey patoc ayin hatef patoc here. So I'm going to say this is a hifil perfect 3ms. Let me go ahead and check that since I'm not absolutely certain and see what we have here for 36C. Hifil perfect, yep. So if this were a hifil imperfect, a hifil infinitive construct, he doesn't give one here, but it would be very similar to this if it were singular. So you see the hifil imperative, the infinitive construct would be the same. That has the patoc that you would expect. So the reason why we go to a hatef segel here is in order to distinguish the 1 guttural hifil perfect from a 1 guttural hifil infinitive construct or hifil imperative or something like that. All right, so I'm glad that one came up because that one actually caused me to pause and think about it. But you can see how, thinking through it, I was able to work out what the answer was. All right, C. Let's look at number 5, and we just saw this, but let's pretend like we didn't. So here, I got a lot of letters. I notice that I've got a shurik suffix. I notice that I've got this hirik yod between 2 root letters. So that's most likely a theme vowel, which is telling me hifil. So in the hifil, if it's perfect, I expect a hifil hirik, or in the case of a 1 guttural, a hifil segel. I have neither. So this is probably not a hifil perfect, which means I'm probably on the imperfect family. Now it's not an imperfect itself because this hey is standing in for a missing imperfect vowel, or imperfect letter, I should say, prefix letter. So this is either going to be a Hiphil imperative or a Hiphil infinitive. Well, it's not a Hiphil infinitive because the shirk doesn't occur on the infinitive, so that means it is a Hiphil imperative. When does the shirk occur on the imperative? That's on the 2MP form. So this is a Hiphil imperative 2MP from Ahmad. Number 6, a couple things that jump out at me right away. Number 1, I have a mem prefix, so I'm thinking participle. Number 2, I have a hirik yod mem suffix, so I'm again thinking participle, this time specifically masculine plural. Now, what is the prefix vowel of the participle under the mem here? It's a patach. That would usually tell me that I'm looking at a Hiphil, because Hiphil likes that A-class prefix vowel, that patach prefix vowel. But again, it's a little tricky because I've got an ayin here, and that ayin may be what's making this patach. Well, the real issue is what participles take a mem prefix? Because the kal doesn't, the nifal doesn't. The PL does, in which case I would have a shava, which means the ayin wouldn't have to take a reduced vowel. The Hiphil does, but it's not. Would it require? Yeah, the Hiphil. No, the Hiphil would not require. Would it? I mean, let's just cut to it here. I know this is Hiphil, primarily because we've got a hirik yod theme vowel, but I'm trying to figure out what a non-one guttural. The non-one guttural would not have a shava in R1, which makes me wonder why we have the shava in R1 here. Let me go back up to the Hiphil participles section and just think through this together here. Sorry. One guttural Hiphil. Okay, let's look at the strong Hiphils. And we'll go to the participle. Oh, okay, it does. For some reason I was thinking it would not require a shava, but it does require a shava. So that makes sense. Alright, so let's go back to our practice here. Alright, so looking at, again, we are on number 6 here. Could be a PL. That would take a mem prefix, but that would be mem shava. And in the PL, R1 would not require a reduced vowel. In the Hiphil, which also takes a mem prefix in the participle, that would be mem patach, and the Hiphil does require R1 to be reduced in order to close that syllable. So this is a good candidate. What else? We've got pual, which you may not have. I guess this week we're reading about the pual, and hofal we're also reading about this week. So those are also options, but those are going to have different. Pual is going to have a shurik under it, under the mem, and hofal is going to have a kamatz hatuf under the mem. The only other option would be hit pa'el, but that would have a tav. It would be mit something. So Hiphil is really our only option. Hiphil is confirmed by the hirik yod theme vowel, and so what we have here is a Hiphil participle, and it is no person but masculine singular. All right. Let's see here. Number 7. All right, so this one's a little bit tricky. Let's just think through it. I don't know off the top of my head, so I'm just going to ask my questions. All right, how many letters do I have? I have 3. Well, that's what I need to have just a simple root. So if this had no prefixes and no suffixes, the only time that occurs is going to be in, assuming that all of these letters are my root, the only time that occurs is going to be in the kal perfect or the kal infinitive construct or the kal imperative 2ms. So is this any of those? Well, let's take a look. Kal perfect. Why would this not be kal perfect? Well, in the kal perfect, my R1 vowel would be a kametz, and then I would have a patak, unless for some reason this were a stative verb. But the hierik doesn't work for cal perfect. That doesn't make any sense. Now, the perfect would take a hierik if this were a PL perfect. And that PL perfect would also explain the dagesh in R2. So, hey, we're off to a good start. Maybe this is PL perfect. What's the problem? Well, the PL perfect in this situation would have a serifim vowel, not a holum. So this can't be PL perfect either. Okay? Well, let's just run through the rest of the perfects. It can't be a nifal perfect because there's no nifal prefix. It can't be a hifil perfect because there's no hifil prefix. So it doesn't look like perfect is an option here, which tells me in that case that it either has to be a cal infinitive construct or a cal imperative. That is to say, if the letters I'm looking at are the root letters, which you're probably getting by now that they're not. But let's run through it. Okay, so now, why could this not be a cal infinitive construct from yod, pei, lamed, root? Well, if this is an infinitive construct, R1 is going to have a shabah, and that's not the case here. The same thing goes for the imperative 2ms. If this were an imperative, we would have a shabah here, which we don't. So none of those work. That means that these cannot be the root letters. So let's figure out what's extra and what's part of the root. Is lamed a suffix? Lamed's never added as a suffix, so we don't have a suffix. Well, what prefixes do we have? Is yod a prefix? Yes, yod does function as a prefix frequently in the imperfect conjugation. So let's assume that's what we've got here. We've got an imperfect. Let's take off the yod hierik prefix and see what's left. Well, I notice that we've got a dagesh in here that needs to be pulled out. Usually that means that we have a one noon in a cal imperfect. The one noon has assimilated. The question is, we're pretty certain this is imperfect. You know, this is an imperfect prefix. I mean, it could be maybe adjussive, but it's not going to be a cohortative because it would have a kametz hey at the end. It's not going to be an imperative because the imperative would lose the prefix. It's not going to be a participle because the participle would have the would not have the prefix here. So if this is a cal imperfect, is everything else accounted for? Do we need a different stem? Do we need maybe a nifal? It's not a nifal imperfect because then we would need a dagesh and a kametz in R1. It's not a hifil imperfect because then we would need a patach in the prefix. Nothing else makes sense. This has to be a cal imperfect. It is a one noon, which has assimilated into the pei. So this is a cal imperfect 3ms of nafal. All right, what about number 8? Same thing, we've just added a shurik here. I could go through all those steps all over again, but really that's the only difference. We've added a shurik, and that has caused the holum to reduce to a shabah. So this here is going to be a cal imperfect 3mp of nafal. All right, and then number 9, let's look at this. Now, as you can see here, very similar. What's the difference between these? We can run through the whole thing again if we have to, but if we can spot one difference that makes sense, that'll save us a lot of time. I would say that difference is the yod has become a tav. That's the only difference here. I mean, the tav has a dagesh, but this is a dagesh lene that's going to occur. This is a weak dagesh that's going to occur in a begad kafat letter when it begins a word, or a syllable for that matter. So that means that the difference between number 7 and number 9 is the prefix letter. Okay, we have a tav prefix instead of a yod. That indicates a shift from 3ms to either 3fs or 2ms. So what we have here in number 9 is a cal imperfect 3fs or 2ms of nafal. All right, let's look at the other section here. And I never unmuted my microphone. So that means that you must be watching the YouTube version that I recorded separately, because otherwise you would not have heard any audio. Might as well,
You are now
I guess,
unmuted.
unmute it, but I will put a note up that the version posted in conferences does not have audio, so I will direct you to a version that I'm going to post on YouTube so that you can actually hear me. All right, well, that's great. Let's see here. Exercise. So we did C. Now let's look at E. All right, so again, I'm just going to pick one of these. I'll do the longest one, which looks like it's number 2. And we'll walk through here. So here we begin with Vaihi. Again, that's sort of a scene setter. So if you want to literally translate this, it would be, and it happened that. When I see a cough here, I'm thinking immediately that it's a temporal preposition, but let's just see what happens. Looking at the rest of this, so I'm going to just go ahead and assume it's a preposition and take it off. That leaves me with hilakhu. Now this may be a little bit intimidating, but let's just go through our process. I mean, this is a strange form. It's got a lot going on here. Let's not assume that cough is a preposition. Let's take this as a word, but we are going to assume that it's some sort of a verb. When you don't recognize a word, run it through the verb process and see if that gives you an answer. And if it doesn't, then you just got to go to your lexicon. But let's run this through the verb process. All right, so how many letters do I have? Well, if I count the holum, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, not to mention the dagesh here. So let's just say 6 for now. I will say that I notice a dagesh and a kametz in a letter. Now, if this is R1, then I've got a lot of prefixes going on, but that does stand out to me, so I'm just going to note it for now. I need to figure out what are my prefixes and what are my suffixes. Does holum vav ever function as a suffix? Yeah, it does. Now, not always on verbs, that is to say finite verbs, but it does function as a pronoun suffix on infinitive constructs, which is something interesting to keep in mind. It could also function as a pronoun suffix on a participle. So we'll just note that holum vav probably is not part of the root here. What about chet? Is chet ever added as a suffix? Never. So we don't have any more suffixes. Holum vav is our only suffix. So let's note that chet is probably part of our root. Now let's see if we can chop off some prefixes. Is cough ever a prefix? Yeah, cough often gets added to, let's say, infinitive constructs again, or participles as some sort of a preposition. So let's take that off. Okay, what about hey? Is hey ever added as a prefix? Yeah, in the perfect conjugation, hey gets added as a prefix in the hifil perfect. And on the infinitive side, hey isn't a prefix in the imperfect, I should say on the imperfect side. Hey is not a prefix itself for the imperfect, but hey does function as a prefix for the nifal infinitive construct, the nifal imperative, and even the nifal infinitive absolute. So those are some options. What about any other? Hifil. The hey functions as a prefix for the hifil perfect, in which case it does have the hiric prefix. It also functions as a prefix for the the hifil infinitive construct and infinitive absolute and imperative, but there it's going to have a patach vowel, which it does not here. So if hey is a prefix, we've either got a hifil perfect, which does not make sense with the whole involved. Whole involved does not get added to perfects. I don't think. Let me think about that. Actually, maybe it would. But we haven't learned about that yet. Have we? Have we learned about that yet? Maybe we have. Form, pronouns, suffixes. Wow, I cannot believe how little information he gives you here about pronouns added to verbs. He doesn't even give you the paradigm. Oh my goodness. That's shocking to me how little information he gives you about this. All right, well, let's not worry about that. However, I will say, even though it is possible, let me go back to... Even though it's possible that maybe the whole involve is added as an object suffix to the perfect, so hifil perfect, the kaf preposition would not be. Kaf preposition is only going to be added to the infinitive or the participle. So let's go that way. Let's say this is an infinitive or participle. What infinitives or participles don't, what infinitives have a hey heric prefix? That's only going to be the nifal infinitive construct. The hifil infinitive construct is going to have a hey patach prefix. So what we've got here, most likely, is a nifal infinitive construct with a holem vav suffix to indicate third masculine singular of the subject or object, and a kaf preposition, which often would be temporal on an infinitive, which would make our root lamed kof chet. Well, lakach means he took, so the infinitive would be to take. The nifal makes it to be taken. Because the nifal is not going to have a direct object, the nifal doesn't have a direct object usually because the nifal is passive, and passive verbs doesn't make sense to have a direct object because the subject is the recipient of the action in a passive verb. So that would mean that the holem vav represents the subject of the infinitive. So that would be he was taken, or he to be taken, him to be taken. Kaf is going to be contemporaneous time. So when he was taken, or at his being taken. So, and it happened that at his being taken to the city, we would probably translate that as, and it happened that when he was taken to the city. And then we've got our main verb here. So, vayika vitsu. Vayika vitsu. All right. So again, right here, I notice, first of all, I've got my vav relative. I've got this dagesh and kametz in R1. So this is going to be a nifal as well. So I have a nifal imperfect, or nifal jussive, truly, 3 MP. Kavatz is collect. So this would be, and they were collected. And it happened that when he was taken to the city, they were collected, or they were gathered. So we've got a shift in subject here. This is a singular subject. Here we've got a plural subject. So when he was taken to the city, they were collected, or they were gathered. Who were gathered? Hazakenim. So the elders were gathered. Or you could say the elders gathered themselves together. Could be reflexive. And it happened that when he was taken to the city, the elders and Hanashim and the men, the elders and the men and the women, Hanashim, and, goodness, their sons, the sons of them, and the daughters of them. Goodness gracious. And it happened that when he was taken to the city, they were gathered. Who were gathered? The elders, and the men, and the women, and their sons and their daughters were all gathered together to him. So they were all gathered to him. And Yomer, Vayomer, so this is from Amar, he said or he thought, and he said to them all, Lahem, Yehi Adonai. So Yehi is the jussive form of Haya. So to be, he was, he will be. Jussive, may he be. May who be? May Adonai be. May Yahweh be imchem, with you. With you all, basically. Whew. All right, so, and it happened that when he was taken to the city, the elders, I shouldn't say the elders and the men and the women and their sons and their daughters were gathered to him. And he said to them, May the Lord be with you. All right, that's a heck of a translation there. I am 2 minutes away from my scheduled video conference with the Elementary 1 class. So I'm going to go ahead and shift over to that. And if I have time, I may come back and do lesson 37. So we may have 2 video conferences for this week, especially since I haven't gotten into the discussion of the final exam at all. But I did send out another announcement kind of talking a little bit about what to expect on the final exam. So even if I can't get another video out this week, you've at least got that. Feel free to send me any questions that you have. We'll go ahead and wrap it up here, and then maybe we'll send out